Hi, I'm Jacinta. Sometimes life gives you moments so sharp they split your world in two before and after. For me, that moment came on the same night my sister decided to save me. She called a family meeting insisting everyone gather to discuss my supposedly failing business. They framed it as love as concern, but it felt more like an intervention staged for a problem child. What they didn't know, what none of them ever seemed to know, was that Forbes had just named me a billionaire. That very night, while they shuffled papers and rehearsed their pity, my name was being written into history. They sat me down like I was a broken puzzle they needed to solve. Job offers slid across the table as if they were lifelines. Words like structure and stability echoed in the room, each syllable heavy with judgment. And all the while, my company, the one they thought was sinking, was quietly reshaping the future of healthcare. But the worst part wasn't their ignorance. It wasn't even the condescension disguised as care. The worst part was the clarity that cut through me like glass they had never seen me. Not then, not ever. I wasn't Jacinta, the founder, the risk-taker, the builder. I was still just the child they could mold, the little sister they could patronize. And so I kept asking myself, what do you do when the people who raised you are the very first to rewrite your story without permission, without even pausing to ask who you've become? And what happens when you finally decide to take the pen back? The message had arrived quietly, almost deceptively. I was rinsing out my coffee mug, letting the water run cool against my fingertips when my phone buzzed. Not an urgent buzz, not the kind that spikes your heart rate. Just a simple vibration carrying words that weighed far heavier than they looked. "We're all worried about you, Jace. Let's come together. Just a family talk." Delaney had a gift for diplomacy. She could lace condescension in silk, make it sound like an invitation instead of a command. Reading her words felt less like being cared for and more like being summoned to a tribunal. I stood in my kitchen longer than I needed to, still holding the mug, drops of water falling into the sink like a metronome. They hadn't called in months. The last time we'd all been in the same room, I had mentioned that I was preparing to take my AI company out of stealth mode. I remember Delaney blinking at me like I was speaking in riddles. My parents nodded along silently as they always did, pretending to understand while retreating behind their polite distance. And yet now they wanted to help. I didn't text back right away. Instead, I opened my calendar, scanned my evening, saw that it was technically free, and closed the app. Some answers don't require words. Sometimes all you need to do is show up. At 3:00 p.m., I left Santa Monica, guiding my modest black Prius north toward Los Altos. The ocean air fell away behind me, replaced by manicured streets, gated lawns, and the suffocating luxury of suburbia. The temperature dipped, the sky turned pale, and with each mile I felt the past tightening its grip. When I pulled into the eastern driveway, my car looked almost embarrassed, sitting between Delaney's gleaming white Range Rover and my father's pristine Navy Tesla. Even the valet seemed unsure whether I belonged, opening my door with the kind of blank politeness reserved for strangers. The house hadn't changed. It never did. A Spanish villa facade carefully curated to look timeless but always faintly performative. Crisp stucco, wrought iron balconies, rosemary hedges trimmed within an inch of their lives. A house that pretended warmth but never held it. Delaney opened the door before I even knocked. Her hair smoothed back to perfection, her blouse tailored within a breath of rigidity. She gave me the kind of cheek kiss that didn't touch skin. Her smile rehearsed, her tone practiced. "Jace," she said as if she were welcoming a guest speaker to her stage. "Thanks for coming." I stepped inside, inhaling the familiar scent, eucalyptus layered with furniture polish. Irene's signature blend, as if cleanliness could substitute for comfort. The living room had been rearranged for the occasion. A long rectangular table dominated the center chairs, lined up with military precision. At the head sat my father, Gerald Ty, loosened but posture-sharp, still playing CEO even in retirement. To his left, Delaney's husband, Marcus, tapped at a laptop, ready to pitch something no one had asked for. On the right, my mother, Irene, swirled a glass of wine like it was a stage prop, her silence as scripted as everything else. And my chair. Of course, it wasn't at the table. Instead, they'd placed a small armchair lower to the ground, angled toward the group like I was there for an interview. Or maybe a confession. A quiet little stage where the problem could be contained. And in that moment, staring at their arrangement, I understood. This wasn't a meeting. This was a performance. And I was the role they'd written for me long ago, the misguided sister, the fragile daughter, the one who needed saving. Only this time, they had no idea the script had already changed. They never said it outright. They didn't have to. The arrangement of the room, the careful choreography of their glances, the way my chair was set apart, it all told the story. I wasn't here as an equal. I wasn't family in this context. I was the subject of the meeting, a problem to be diagnosed, managed, and solved. So I did the only thing I could. I sat down without a word. No coat removal, no polite smile, no attempt at easing into their performance. I simply crossed one ankle over the other, settled into the low chair they had chosen for me, and waited. Delaney, always the conductor of these family symphonies, took her place next to Marcus. She straightened a stack of papers she didn't need, cleared her throat like a professor preparing to lecture. I know this isn't easy. She began, her voice pitched in that practiced softness therapists use when they're reading from a script. My mother chimed in right on cue, her wine glass tilting in her hand like a prop she'd rehearsed with. "We've all noticed you've been quiet." Irene said, her tone tight, polished, over-rehearsed. The words sounded like they had been tried on in front of a mirror until they no longer carried warmth, only performance. It's been months since we've heard anything. I let the silence linger a beat too long before answering. "You haven't asked." My voice came out flat-clipped, more blade than tone. My father leaned forward, elbows planted on the polished wood of the table, fingers laced together like a judge weighing his next ruling. "We don't want to pry, honey," he said, his voice carrying the faint echo of authority he never quite left behind even in retirement. "But the startup world is volatile. We just want to make sure you have options." There it was. That word. Options. Spoken as if I hadn't already carved a company out of nothing but my own willpower. As if the empire I was building was just an unfinished sketch they were generously offering to complete. Options, because in their eyes I had still chosen wrong. Delaney nodded, satisfied, like my father had played the line exactly as scripted. "Exactly," she added smoothly. "That's why we thought it might be good to talk through some ideas together. You know, explore possibilities." A laugh rose in my chest, sharp and bitter, but I swallowed it. I kept my expression neutral, my hands steady in my lap. I wasn't here to defend my company. I wasn't even here to fight. I was here to listen. Really listen to what they believed about me when they thought I couldn't push back. Tonight I wanted the air cleared once and for all. Irene lifted her glass delicately, swirling the wine in a slow circle. "We just want our Jacinta back," she murmured. The sentence landed softly, like velvet draped across the room. But I heard the steel beneath it. It wasn't a wish, it was a verdict. And it sliced deeper than if she had shouted. I glanced down at my phone lying quietly on the arm of my chair. One unread email. Subject: Forbes, final confirmation. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I felt its presence like a heartbeat. They didn't want me back. Not really. They wanted me back where they could recognize me, smaller, manageable, safely tucked into the version of me they'd always known. But I wasn't going back. And tonight they were going to learn who I had become when no one was watching. So I didn't storm out. I didn't stand up and shatter their carefully arranged stage. I stayed exactly where they wanted me, low, quiet, underestimated. My composure was my disguise, my stillness, my weapon. Delaney shifted in her seat, her posture too precise to be natural. She folded her hands together, readying herself as though she were in a boardroom about to present quarterly earnings. So she said, her tone crisp, practiced. "We were hoping you could walk us through what you're working on these days. You know, high level, just so we're all aligned." Aligned. A word that belonged to mergers and acquisitions, not families. I inhaled, not because I needed the breath, but because I wanted to measure patience in seconds. I've been finalizing a diagnostic model for acute stage oncology patients. I began slowly, deliberately. The initial deployment is... Delaney leaned forward, slicing into my sentence like it was hers to interrupt. "We all know how hard it is to keep a business afloat," she said, her tone both knowing and dismissive, especially when it's just you. just me. The words settled like lead. I turned my eyes to my father, silently willing him to tilt the balance. To say something, anything that might validate me, even a fraction. But Gerald sat frozen, his gaze fixed on the water glass before him, as if the condensation dripping down its side could spare him from speaking. Silence in my family had always been its own answer, and tonight it was my father's way of choosing his side. Marcus jumped in next ever, the opportunist leaning forward with the gleam of someone who smelled an opening. Let's be honest, Jace. Marcus began leaning back just enough to feign ease his tone, carrying that manufactured warmth he thought passed for sincerity. You're brilliant. Everyone here knows that. But being the smartest one in the room doesn't always mean you should be running the room, you know. He chuckled softly after the line, a rehearsed little laugh that was meant to disarm, to soften the edge of the blade he'd just delivered. But the laugh fell flat. No one joined him. No one needed to. The words had already cut their way across the room and landed exactly where he intended. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. But somewhere inside me, something shifted, a quiet door closing with finality. It wasn't the sting of insult that did it. I had learned long ago how to metabolize that. No, what lodged itself deep was the precision. That kind of phrasing doesn't tumble out by accident. It comes from practice, from repetition, from whispered conversations, where they'd been aligning their story about me long before I arrived. Delaney gave a single, almost imperceptible nod like a physician confirming the results of a diagnosis already suspected. That's why we're here, she said smoothly, her voice a blend of authority and feigned compassion. To help you realign. There's no shame in course correction. No shame. The words slid across the table like polished stones, each one meant to weigh me down. No shame in folding years of vision into someone else's spreadsheet. No shame in reducing sleepless nights, decades of thought, the marrow of my ambition, into a tidy 3-bullet plan they could understand. I said nothing. Instead, my eyes drifted past Delaney, drawn to the wall behind her. A painting I'd never noticed before hung there, our great-grandmother. She stared out from the frame with steady eyes, a woman carved of grit and silence. She had built a textile business in the middle of the war, when men were scarce, when women were told to wait, to keep, to endure. Rumor had it she'd been asked to keep quiet about her earnings at church, to lower her gaze when the men spoke of markets and trade. She didn't fit their mold, so they called her an exception. And exceptions in this family were quietly filed away. That's what they do with women like her. Women like me. When we refuse to bend into their expectations, they try to fold us smaller. If we can't be erased, we're contained, rewritten, forgotten. I tore my gaze back to Delaney, who was now in full presentation mode, clicking something on her laptop as if she were leading a quarterly review. She didn't even realize she'd already lost me. That's the flaw with people like her. They're so busy controlling the narrative, they never notice when the subject stops playing along and starts observing the observers. The room settled into that brittle quiet, the kind that isn't peace but pressure. The hush that follows when people think they've said something constructive and are waiting for your gratitude. I reached for my glass of water. Slowly, deliberately, letting the pause stretch until it ached. Then I leaned forward, my voice calm but sharpened with intent. Funny, I said evenly. You say I'm not a leader. And yet every time I start talking, all of you rush to interrupt. The silence that followed was different now. Heavier. Delaney's lips parted, but no words came. Marcus shifted in his chair, suddenly fascinated with the table's polished surface. My father adjusted his tie out of habit, though he wasn't even wearing one. Irene's hand tightened faintly around her wine glass, her carefully rehearsed serenity cracking at the edges. I didn't need them to respond. That wasn't the point. I needed them to hear what it sounded like when someone stopped waiting for permission, stopped asking for space, and simply took it. Irene cleared her throat, her voice trembling just slightly as she reached for her old weapon's soft denial. Sweetheart, no one's interrupting. We're just trying to manage the damage I finished for her, not cruelly, but with a clarity that left no room for retreat. My words fell like a hand pulling back a curtain, exposing the stage for what it really was. I let my gaze circle the room. Not with anger, not with desperation, but with the stillness of someone who finally sees clearly. They weren't trying to save me. They weren't even trying to help. They were trying to reclaim me to fold me back into the version of myself that was comfortable for them before the world realized I had outgrown the box they'd so carefully built. And for the first time, I think they realized I wasn't going back. I pushed my chair back, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the kind of quiet finality that makes people look up even when no sound is made. The legs glided against the hardwood controlled deliberate. I rose to my feet and smoothed the front of my blazer. The old one. The one with the slightly frayed cuff and softened seams. I knew what they saw, a woman clinging to scraps, a daughter too stubborn to admit she was failing a sister dressing respectability in secondhand fabric. Let them believe it. Let them keep their illusions. They hadn't believed in me 3 years ago when I walked away from a salary, from the safety net, from the version of success they understood. They hadn't believed in me last year when the company demanded everything and I refused to bend. And tonight, sitting there beneath the weight of their concern, they still didn't believe. But what Delaney did next proved she never intended to. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she reached beneath the polished mahogany table, her fingers curling around something metallic. A slim silver USB drive. She held it like an ace she'd been waiting to play, rose from her chair with the poise of someone who believed the stage was hers, and crossed to the television mounted above the fireplace. The movement was rehearsed, too smooth, too confident. This wasn't spontaneous intervention. This was choreography. With a flick of her wrist, the drive slid into the port. The screen blinked dark for a beat, then bloomed with a sterile glow. Letters appeared in a corporate font. Cold and efficient stability plan, 90 days to reset. Reset, like I was a machine that had stalled. Not broken enough to discard, not ruined beyond repair, just malfunctioning. And in their minds, a system reboot would make me useful again. The air shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-thought. My parents leaned forward the way executives do when a quarterly forecast begins, eyes narrowing with focus. Marcus, ever eager to prove his role, adjusted the volume with the remote as if this were a boardroom update rather than a family ambush. No one asked questions. No one objected. Not even a whisper of doubt. They all just accepted the theater of it as if the show had already been sold out and I was the last to see the poster. I stayed silent. My body still, my face unreadable. The first slide appeared, a color-coded roadmap. Phases, metrics, milestones, every box neatly contained, every path neatly predicted. Slide 2, transition plan. From entrepreneurial overextension to corporate reintegration. Their words, not mine. Reintegration like I was an exile finally being ushered back into civilization. Slide 3, a proposed role. Executive Assistant of Business Development. A job title inflated just enough to sound impressive at dinner parties, hollow enough to keep me tethered. Beneath it, recommended relocation, Nevada. A quieter market, lower stress, more structure. They didn't want me grounded. They wanted me erased. Moved to a smaller town, parked behind a cubicle, muted beneath a title that kept me small but palatable. I scanned the slide carefully. The language was vague, sanitized, as if written by someone allergic to ambition. Synergy, corporate wellness, realignment. The kind of words that look polished on a deck but feel like shackles in real life. And then I noticed my name wasn't even on the slide. Not once. It was a plan about me without me. A blueprint drafted for a shadow. Slide 4 arrived, family support commitments, which stripped of its shiny heading meant rules, weekly check-ins, mandatory financial reviews, a shared document for progress tracking. My life reduced to status reports, my choices audited like expense receipts. Irene smiled, then the soft, satisfied smile of someone who believed order had finally been restored. Proud of how neat it looked, how organized, how manageable. And for a few seconds, I wasn't in the room anymore. I wasn't their daughter, their sister, their blood. I was a project, a case file, a misaligned asset to be restructured. They didn't want to hear what I'd been building. They didn't care about the vision that had consumed my nights or the breakthroughs that were reshaping the future. They didn't want to listen. They wanted to overwrite. I stared at the glowing screen, but I didn't really see it. My eyes were there, but my mind had pulled away, retreating to someplace quieter, stronger. A place where their voices could not define me anymore. My eyes drifted past the slides, the sterile flowcharts, the bullet points arranged like neat little cages. For a moment, the room blurred and I was pulled back into a memory I hadn't touched in years. The day I walked away from my consulting job. I remember the air outside that office tower, too bright, too sharp, as if the whole world was watching me. Exhale the weight of a decision I couldn't take back. The resignation letter still felt warm in my hand, the ink pressed into the page like a wound I'd made myself. My chest ached with equal parts fear and freedom, my pulse erratic like a drum calling me forward and holding me back at the same time. And the first thing I did wasn't call a friend. Not Marcus, my CFO. Not an investor. Not even one of the peers who might have understood the risk. I called my parents. I thought just maybe they'd surprise me. That they'd hear the tremor in my voice, feel the weight of what I had just done, and meet me with something real. Instead, my mother asked, "Are you okay?" Not in the tender emotional sense, not the kind of okay that means I see you, I believe in you. No. It was the careful tone of someone probing for cracks, as if she were gently testing for signs of a mental break. And my father. His words were measured, almost clinical. It's okay to fail once. Just don't make it permanent. That was the last time I tried to explain myself to them. And tonight in this room filled with polished slides and careful rehearsals, I realized nothing had changed. They weren't using the same words, but it was the same language. Only now it was better rehearsed. Better lit, dressed up as strategy instead of concern. Delaney paused the slide deck and fixed her gaze on me. She had perfected this look over years of boardrooms and strategy sessions, calm, confident, immovable. "We think this gives you structure," she said evenly. "It gets you back on track. Back on track." As if their track was the only one that mattered. I stayed silent not because I was weak, not because I had nothing to say, but because I wanted to watch them make their case in full. To let the mask slip all the way to see every angle of how they'd already rewritten my story without asking me. Delaney had rehearsed this. I could see it in the precision of her words, the way her shoulders squared each time she delivered a line. She had probably even role-played my responses, imagined my anger, my tears, the dramatic rejection that would confirm her belief that I wasn't stable. She liked to be 10 moves ahead. Always. But instead of giving her what she expected, I leaned forward slightly. Let the silence stretch until it was taut, and then spoke. "This plan," I said slowly, carefully, "is very thoughtful." I let the words hang just a beat too long until the compliment bent under its own weight. But it's based on a version of me that never existed. The room shifted. Not in motion, but in atmosphere. The silence thickened, uncomfortable now, no longer the polished quiet of control, but the raw stillness of something unraveling. Delaney exhaled sharply through her nose, the first crack in her composure. Irene lowered her eyes to her wine, swirling it as if she could hide inside the glass. Gerald straightened in his seat, his jaw tightening, but he didn't meet my gaze. I wasn't done. I'm not the woman who needs saving. I continued keeping my voice steady, letting each word fall with deliberate weight. I'm the one who walked away so I wouldn't drown. For the first time that evening, Delaney faltered. Just for a second, but enough. Her expression flickered annoyance, disbelief, maybe even fear. Then, like the professional she always was, she caught it and reset her face to neutral. But I had seen it, and she knew I had. I didn't bother explaining the details of what I'd built. The sleepless nights, the code rewritten until dawn, the prototypes tested and scrapped, the breakthroughs no one clapped for. I didn't list the cities where my systems were already saving lives, or the teams I'd scraped together from nothing but vision and stubbornness, because they wouldn't get it. They never really wanted to. And I won't apologize. I added my voice firm, almost quiet, but carrying through the room like a current. For not being the girl you wrote this plan for. That was the moment it landed. Delaney closed her laptop not dramatically, but with the small clipped motion of someone conceding a round. Irene blinked rapidly like she'd been holding back tears that never came. And Gerald finally looked at me. Not with anger, not even disappointment, but with a kind of confusion, like he was seeing a daughter he couldn't place. Which in a way he was, because I wasn't the same. Not in spite of their absence, but because of it. And I didn't have to wait long to see what their next move would be. Delaney, ever the strategist, didn't give the silence a chance to breathe. She reached down, smoothly opened a slim leather folio, and pulled out a neatly printed folder, the kind with margins too wide fonts, too clean the illusion of authority without an ounce of heart. She slid it across the table toward me the way one slides a peace treaty or a contract or a verdict. "This is something we put together." Delaney said, her tone smooth, deliberate, carrying that familiar air of authority disguised as care. She used "we" as though it were a family crest, a shield meant to sanctify every decision under the banner of unity. We. As if collective intent could erase the sting of individual betrayal. I know how isolating things can feel when things don't go as expected. She continued, her voice tilting into something almost tender, almost maternal. But this is a great step. A good reset. Reset. Like I was a machine with a faulty circuit. Like all it would take was one button, one plan, one folder to erase years of blood, sweat, and sacrifice and put me neatly back where they wanted me. I stared at the folder resting in front of me without reaching for it. The paper was thick, creamy, the kind of stock people choose when they want to make something appear weighty, official, grand. Expensive paper meant to disguise the cheapness of its contents. Delaney tapped the top of it lightly, coaxing like she was trying to get a skittish animal to eat from her hand. "It's a role with Stratwell Solutions," she said with a perfectly timed pause, waiting for gratitude that never came. "You'd be joining as Assistant Director of Strategic Outreach." Assistant. The word hung there between us like an insult in silk wrapping. She said it without hesitation, maybe even with pride, as though she hadn't just demoted me in front of everyone under the pretense of care. "It's a solid company," Delaney went on, ignoring or pretending not to notice the weight of what she'd just said. "Very organized. Strong leadership team. There's flexibility in the schedule and the environment's less intense. A lot less pressure than what you've been under." No one in the room said a word. Not Gerald. Not Irene. Silence spread out like a dark pool, heavy and complicit. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the folder. Each bullet point felt like a blueprint for someone else's life, not mine. Relocation. Salary polished enough to sound respectable, hollow enough to mean nothing. Benefits that stopped at the bare minimum. No equity. No stake. No voice. A safe little cage wrapped in language about stability. "It's a stable role," Delaney repeated, her voice soft. Now too soft. The kind of softness people use when they want to smother resistance without appearing cruel. Something to rebuild confidence. Confidence. Mine wasn't what needed repairing. Across the table, Marcus finally chimed in, leaning forward with that smirk he wore like armor, equal parts condescending and performative. "It's a great chance to get your feet back under you, Jace. Not everyone's built for leadership. And that's okay." He even chuckled at the end, as if tossing me a consolation prize. I didn't respond. I didn't blink. Instead, I closed the folder with careful precision, as though it were something both fragile and toxic at once. Then I slid it back across the table, my movements deliberate, steady, unshaken. "Is this really what you think I need?" I asked, my voice level, my eyes cutting across each of theirs. "Or is it what makes you feel better about where I am?" The question fell like glass shattering on marble. No one moved. Marcus cleared his throat tone, dropping into something falsely conciliatory. "Come on, don't take it personally. It's just a realistic step forward. We all want what's best for you." That word again. Realistic. I turned my gaze back to Delaney, holding it until she couldn't pretend not to notice. "You keep calling it a step forward," I said evenly. "But for who?" Her smile flickered just for a second, but the falter was enough to confirm she'd heard the weight of the question. "It's a path toward something more manageable," she replied carefully. "You've been through a lot. Everyone here knows that." "You mean I didn't take the path you built for me?" I cut in, my tone sharp but calm. Delaney's jaw tightened. "No, it's about helping you regain direction. You mean control. I corrected, letting the truth cut the air open. Let's call it what it is. Her lips pressed into a thin line color, rising faintly in her cheeks. Marcus leaned back in his chair, eyes darting between us like he was watching a tennis match he wanted no part in. I sat taller, let the silence grow until it was almost unbearable, then spoke again, this time to all of them. I've been quiet tonight, more patient than I should be, but I'm done letting you talk over me. Then I turned my full attention back to Delaney, my voice steady, my stare unflinching. If you keep shrinking me just to make room for yourself, I said slowly, each word measured, deliberate, then you'd better be prepared for what happens when I stand back up. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger spilling over. It was truth, sharp and clean as glass, a fact spoken out loud for the first time. A prediction, not a warning. Delaney's lips parted as if she had a retort ready, some polished line rehearsed for this exact moment. But before she could speak, Irene leaned in, her bracelets clinking softly, as though even they wanted attention. Let's not escalate this, she interjected quickly. Voice pitched, high and false sweet, the way someone might speak to children squabbling over toys. This isn't about power, girls. This is about healing. No. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I let the word hang heavy in the room until the silence around it became unbearable. Then I continued, steady, certain. This is about hierarchy. About image. About the fact that Delaney can't stand the idea that I built something she doesn't understand, can't control, can't claim as her own. Gerald shifted in his chair. His tie slipped sideways. Though he wasn't wearing one, his gestures always out of sync with the reality around him. He didn't speak, of course. He never did. His silence had always been his most consistent contribution, absence disguised as presence, a father-shaped outline that never filled in. No one moved. The air thickened, brittle, like that fragile second right before glass slips from a hand and shatters across tile. I stood. The chair scraped softly against the polished floor, the sound louder than any of their carefully curated words. Excuse me? I said evenly, slipping my phone from the table into my hand. I just need a minute. Some air. And without waiting for permission, I turned and walked toward the glass doors leading to the garden. The cold met me like an old friend, sharp, bracing, alive. The air stung against my skin, but it was a relief, a cleansing. I stepped off the stone path, past the manicured hedges Irene loved to boast about, past the flawless order that mirrored her need for control, until I was far enough away that the muffled buzz of voices faded behind me. My phone vibrated. I glanced down. A new message lit the screen. Maya EA CNBC requested comment. Forbes DM'd again. It's happening. I froze, thumb-hovering breath caught between disbelief and inevitability. It was happening. The confirmation I hadn't said aloud but had been carrying like a secret flame in my chest. They thought this job offer, this folder, would humble me. That they could corner me, shrink me, rewrite me until I fit neatly back into their narrative. They wanted to hand me a cage with a salary and call it rescue. But tonight, the script had flipped. I wasn't the one scrambling for validation. I wasn't the one desperate to be let back in. When I walked back inside, I expected stupidly maybe that someone would at least look up. That someone would ask where I had gone. That anyone would act like my absence had mattered. But the moment the glass door clicked shut behind me, I knew better. The room had already resumed without me, like I'd been muted the entire time. Delaney head bent, thumbs moving quick over her phone, no doubt typing some damage control text to her husband. Gerald leafed through papers he didn't need, eyes skimming lines that meant nothing. Irene refilled her wine with the serenity of someone who had already decided how the evening would end her way. Not a single head lifted. Not one. I walked slowly, deliberately back toward the table. My steps didn't rush. I wanted them to hear it, the quiet return of someone they thought had slipped out meekly. I passed behind them, let the silence breathe. Let it stretch until even the air felt like it was waiting for me to speak. Eventually, it was Delaney who broke it. Her voice brighter than before, artificial in its cheer, like someone restarting a meeting after a minor technical glitch. So she said, without glancing up, where were we? She spoke as if the last few minutes had been nothing more than a pause for refills, as if what had just happened wasn't a reckoning but a momentary inconvenience. I didn't answer. I simply lowered myself back into my chair, folded my hands neatly in my lap, and let the silence coil tight around us. If they wanted this conversation to continue, they would have to work for it. Delaney didn't miss a beat. She never did. But this time she was playing against a clock she didn't know was already running out. I think what's most important now, Delaney said, clicking her pen shut like she was ending a boardroom slide, is making sure we reduce further exposure. I tilted my head, letting the silence stretch before I asked evenly, exposure to what? For the first time that evening, she hesitated. Just a flicker, but it was there, the brief pause before she draped her words in velvet. To bad press. To missteps. You've worked hard, obviously. We just want to be proactive, especially with the apartment still in transition. The apartment. I turned slowly to Irene, my mother, who had been swirling her wine so delicately, it looked like she was tracing circles into time itself. The apartment, I asked. She cleared her throat in that gentle, well-practiced way of hers. Your father and I were talking earlier. We thought it might be wise to hold off on finalizing the deed just until you're through this phase. Phase. The word landed like a diagnosis. A temporary illness, a fever, a fog. Something contagious that would pass if I simply rested long enough, medicated myself with compliance, let them measure me back into shape. I nodded once. Not out of agreement, not even acknowledgement, just a signal that I'd heard her. Don't worry, I said flatly. I don't need it. The words came easier than I expected, almost like muscle memory. But in my mind, I was already erasing it, the tiny balcony where I once imagined coffee at sunrise. The gas stove I'd mentioned, loving the sunlight that poured through the windows in the late afternoon. Gone. Another mirage they dangled just long enough for me to think it could be mine. Gerald shifted in his chair, the leather groaning softly beneath him. Still nothing from him. His silence wasn't just passivity anymore. It was participation, the kind that left fingerprints without ever touching the scene. That's when Velma, who had been sitting quietly in the corner like an anxious spectator nibbling crackers no one offered her, leaned forward just slightly. She whispered, but not softly enough. Delaney told me she was sure Jacintha would be back. Something about burnout. And losing focus. Her head turned, then her eyes widening as she realized I was watching her. Oh, you weren't supposed to hear that. I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. My voice stayed calm, almost tender. You'd be surprised what I hear I said when no one's asking me anything directly. Delaney didn't defend herself, didn't even shift in her seat. And in a way, that silence said more than Velma's slip ever could. The room itself seemed to lean closer, the walls drawing in like the house was listening. I breathed in slow and deliberate, not for oxygen, but to buy time. To take inventory. Delaney, her face composed into that polished mask of indifference she wore like armor. Marcus fussing with the cuff of his shirt, avoiding my eyes. Gerald pretending to reread the same document for the third time, his silence louder than any speech. Irene tracing the rim of her wineglass as if answers lived in the circle. And Velma suddenly fascinated by her purse, wishing she could shrink small enough to slip inside it. It was also performative. And yet, in their theater, they revealed everything. I'm not coming back, I said at last, my voice quiet but unshakable. Their heads lifted almost in unison. Not to the version of me you built in your heads. She was never real. Delaney opened her mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to dress another sentence in silk, but I didn't give her the chance. I tried for years to be digestible, to be palatable enough for this room, to be small enough not to offend the story you preferred. But I've outgrown needing your approval, and I am done shrinking to fit your narratives. No shouting, no tears, just truth sharp enough to cut the air. I stood again, not hurried, not dramatic, just certain. I walked past the sideboard where the thick envelope with the apartment deed sat like bait. It was still there untouched, waiting for me to reach out. I didn't even glance at it. My phone buzzed. I slid it out, thumb brushing the screen. From Marcus CFO, subject Forbes, feature locked. CNBC moved your interview to prime slot. Just say the word. For a second, the room disappeared. My family blurred at the edges, replaced by that single notification glowing against the glass. The world was waiting. Not for them. For me. I stared at it, breath steady, then typed one word into the reply field. Release. I pressed send. A quiet power washed through me, not fireworks, not thunder. Something steadier, something unshakable. Like a door had just opened and I was already on the other side. I had already tried the polite route. I had smiled when I was expected to, swallowed words sharp enough to cut, made myself smaller to fit the outlines they had drawn for me. Compliance had been my currency. Tonight, I returned it to them like counterfeit bills and reclaimed everything else that was mine. When I re-entered the living room, I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. The air shifted before anyone moved, a tremor almost imperceptible, like the room itself sensed what I had done outside. I walked slowly toward the center of the space, each step deliberate. Past the untouched folder on the sideboard, its offer papers still waiting like bait, no one wanted to admit was poisoned. Past Irene, my mother whose empty wine glass rested delicately in her hand like a prop she refused to put down. Past Gerald, who glanced up, startled only to lower his gaze again to his lap, as if the wrinkles in his trousers suddenly required study. My phone buzzed in my palm. I didn't check it. Instead, I placed it face down on the coffee table, a silent punctuation mark between us. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out my tablet. Calmly, almost casually, as though I were about to show them a slideshow from a holiday trip, not dismantle the scaffolding of their illusion. Delaney straightened in her chair, her posture a shade too stiff. Her fingers froze above her phone, stilled in the act of tapping out another control-scripted text. Her eyes stayed on me, wide and wary. That look, I knew it. It was the same look she'd worn the very first time I told her no, and she realized I meant it. I tapped the screen. The television above the mantel flickered, then glowed to life as the connection synced. The logo appeared first. My company's name, white letters on a black field. Medicine Labs. Simple. Clean. Unapologetically bold. Then the headlines slide, post-Series C valuation, $1.8 billion. The number hung in the room like thunder after lightning. Marcus made a sound sharp and short. Not quite a cough, more like a fragment of pride stuck somewhere between his chest and his throat. The next slide appeared on its own AI-driven diagnostics deployed in 7 major hospital systems across the U.S. I didn't narrate. I didn't need to. Words in this house had always been rationed, twisted, politicized. Tonight, the data could speak for me. Facts didn't ask permission. They simply existed. When I finally looked up, I saw the silence land on their faces. Delaney's eyes opened too wide, blinking less than natural. Her lips parted as though she wanted to argue, but couldn't quite find the shape of a rebuttal. Irene, her hand still frozen halfway the wine glass suspended between the table and her mouth, her arm trembling ever so slightly. Gerald, his gaze locked on the screen, unblinking his usual absence, replaced by something like awe, or maybe fear. I built this, I said softly, breaking the stillness, while you were busy building a narrative to fix me. No one moved. You talked about helping me get back on track. I continued, my eyes moving slowly from face to face. And the entire time, none of you thought to ask where I was actually going. Then my gaze landed on Gerald. He shifted in his seat as if I had physically pressed him back into it. You held a meeting about my failure? I said each word careful, deliberate, without once picking up the phone to ask if I was okay. His throat clicked before his voice did. That's not fair. You wanted control. My interruption was clean, surgical. Let's not dress it up. I turned to Irene next. My mother. Her eyes flinched just slightly when mine met hers. You said you wanted me back, but what you really wanted was the version of me who made your friends comfortable. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Finally, my gaze fell on Delaney. She sat perfectly still. The storm inside her betrayed only by the twitch in her jaw. You didn't have to blindside us like this. Jace, she said at last. Her voice clipped thinner than usual. Blindside you. My brows lifted. You mean prove you wrong? She swallowed, her voice dropping. I mean humiliate us. In our own home. I let the silence expand again before answering. You humiliated yourselves? I said quietly the moment you decided I would fail. The room did not move. The silence was absolute, sharp enough to hear the weight of everything unsaid. You all decided who I was. I said, my voice steady, but cutting through the silence like glass without ever checking if I agreed. Delaney's lips parted, ready to form another carefully rehearsed line, but I didn't give her the chance. You spent weeks building a plan to stabilize me. I continued, the word laced with quiet disdain. Weeks, meetings, drafts, probabilities, but you never stopped to consider I was already solid, that maybe I didn't need to be managed like some wayward intern. I needed to be left alone, trusted, respected. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his polished charm slipping just enough to show the cracks. This is getting a little dramatic, he muttered, as if tossing a bucket of cold water would reset the scene. I turned to him slowly, my gaze sharp enough to pin him where he sat. No, Marcus. Dramatic would be you standing in a boardroom saying I wasn't fit to lead, while pitching your second failed startup to one of my junior VCs last month. The blood drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again. I read the pitch deck. My voice didn't rise, didn't need to. I own the firm. Your NDA didn't apply to me. The silence that followed wasn't reverent, it was realization, heavy and suffocating. The kind that forces everyone to see the truth they've been dodging. I moved toward the folder, still sitting on the table, their grand solution, their carefully packaged insult. Picking it up between two fingers, I flipped it open again as if inspecting a relic from another world. Pages of roles, salaries, bullet points, all laid out like I was supposed to be grateful for crumbs. I let the word hang, lifting the folder slightly for emphasis, is insulting. Not because of the salary, not even the role, but because you assumed I'd take it. You still believe I need your scaffolding to stand. You never realized I outgrew it a long time ago. Then, with deliberate slowness, I let the papers slide back into the folder and placed it gently, not angrily, not theatrically, but with cold precision into the trash bin by the bookshelf. The sound of it settling was louder than any argument. My phone buzzed again. This time I flipped it over. The notification glowed against the dim room. CNBC 9:15 p.m. interview confirmed. Full segment. National coverage. I looked up. My voice was calm, unshaken. This isn't the climax of my story. I gestured vaguely at the table, the charts, the folder now buried in trash. This is just where your version ends. And then, after a pause that seemed to stretch the air taut, I added, because I built something bigger than this house ever expected. Delaney's fingers clenched just slightly on the table edge, betraying her composure. She wanted to speak, to claw back control, to reassert her place atop the hierarchy she'd built brick by brick. But for the first time, she knew better. She stayed silent. I tapped my tablet screen. The presentation blinked dark and the mantle TV went black. It's going to be a long night, I said, turning my gaze squarely on her. For all of us. I reached for my coat. Not the muted apologetic one they might have chosen for me. Not the kind of garment that blends into the wallpaper of their carefully curated lives. No, this was the coat I chose, the one that made a statement without needing to raise its voice. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt the weight of that room press against my back, the years of silence, of subtle punishments, of coded expectations. But for the first time in a long time, it wasn't mine to carry. I left it there with them. When I stepped back in, the air was sharper, colder. Not brighter cold. The kind of cold that seeps in when the performance ends and everyone realizes the masks have slipped. Delaney had used the minutes I was gone to regroup. Her laptop was open again, the projector casting a new image on the wall. Not graphs, not charts. A photograph. Of me. I froze, mid-step, breath caught in my throat. Not in shock, no, in recognition. Whatever came next, they weren't done trying to rewrite me. It was me, on the screen. A photo I didn't even know existed me at a co-working space in San Francisco maybe 2 years ago. I was smiling faintly mid-sentence, clearly distracted by someone just out of frame. It was candid, unpolished, intimate in a way that no one but me should have been allowed to decide whether to share. My throat tightened. It felt invasive, like someone had reached into a private moment and nailed it to the wall for everyone to dissect. Beneath the photo in bold serif font was the title, 5-Year Vision, Jacintha Easton, Director of Growth Rook Easton Initiative. My name? My face. Their agenda. Delaney stood at the front of the room, backlit by the projection like a politician about to launch a campaign. Her chin tilted upward, posture immaculate, the same pose she perfected at charity galas and press dinners, the kind that said authority without question. She was playing this like her last desperate move in a chess match she was already losing. I thought this might help us visualize the next step, she said brightly. Too brightly. This could be our shared legacy. There it was, that word again. Our. A word she only used when she wanted credit for something she didn't build. I took one slow step forward, not rushing, not raising my voice. You used a photo of me, I said, steady but sharp, without asking. It's public? She replied quickly, defensive, before she even finished. Someone posted it after that founders panel. I just thought it captured something real. No. My voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through her excuse. It captured what you wanted me to be. Not what I am. She didn't blink. Her jaw stayed locked, her hands poised on the clicker. This isn't controlled, Jace, she insisted. It's strategy. A win-win. I let the silence stretch, then turned to the screen again, letting the slide burn into my vision before shifting my gaze back to her. You mean it's yours with my face on it? Delaney hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. That's not fair, she managed. Oh, it's more than fair. I leaned in, my voice low but deliberate. In fact, it's generous. Around us, the room barely breathed. Gerald shifted in his chair, adjusting his cufflinks with hands that looked steadier than they were. Irene gripped her glass of wine like it was the only thing tethering her to the moment. Marcus stared down at the floor as if avoiding my eyes could erase the shame pooling in the air. Delaney clicked forward anyway, as if sheer momentum could bulldoze over the truth. The next slide appeared. Text, numbers, a line about early investor interest. There's someone who's been quietly, thoughtfully willing to support your company, she said, tone softer now, almost coaxing. I thought maybe you'd recognize the code. My body reacted before my mouth did. My pulse spiked, heat rising through my chest. I took another step closer. M739B. Her hand froze on the clicker. The room went utterly still. That was the application code, I said slowly, from a Shell LLC linked to your marketing firm. You submitted it through a third-party platform. You thought I wouldn't notice. I let each word land, each syllable deliberate, but I read every line. Delaney's composure cracked just a flicker. A breath caught. I turned it down. I added, because I don't take money from people who try to own me through the back door. Her voice, when it came, was low, fragile. I wasn't trying to control you. Then why hide it? My voice snapped before I could temper it, sharper than I intended. Why not call me? Why not say it openly? Tell me you believed in what I was building instead of sneaking behind shell companies like I wouldn't notice. Her jaw clenched, the mask slipping, but not yet gone. You don't have to turn this into a fight. I stared at her, unblinking. Delaney. It was always a fight. You just thought I wouldn't notice. The weight of the words hung heavy. Marcus cleared his throat softly, the sound pitiful in the silence, like he wished he could vanish into the wallpaper. I let my eyes sweep across the room, my family, the people who were supposed to know me best. And I saw it clear as the projection still burning behind Delaney's shoulders. Shame. Not the kind that comes with remorse, but the kind that comes from being caught. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they hadn't hidden it better. I straightened my shoulders, every inch of me. Calm now, steady, unflinching. I'm done. I said finally. Done with the passive-aggressive check-ins. Done with the fake support that only shows up when it makes good PR. And I am especially. I paused, letting the silence sharpen into a blade done being rewritten in PowerPoint. Delaney's hand dropped from the clicker. The projection froze behind her, my stolen image still glowing on the wall. But it didn't own me anymore. Delaney's finger tapped the button, and with a muted click, the projector went dark. The screen moments ago, blazing with my stolen image, dissolved into black. The room seemed to release all at once an audible exhale, as though every person inside had been holding their breath and didn't even realize it. A low rustle of movement followed chairs, shifting throats, clearing someone's pen, clattering to the floor. I moved toward her, slow and deliberate, not rushed, not reckless. My footsteps were the only sound that mattered. I didn't yell. I didn't gesture wildly. There was no need. When I reached her, I took the remote clicker gently from her frozen hand and pressed it back into her palm. My voice, low and steady, carried more weight than shouting ever could. "If this is your vision," I said, looking her directly in the eyes, "then feel free to keep it. But don't ever put my face on it again." Her lips parted like she might argue, but no words came. Not a defense, not an apology, just silence. I turned away. At the edge of the room, just as the heavy quiet threatened to collapse around me, my phone buzzed in the pocket of my coat. A vibration, faint but insistent, pulling me back into a world where my name wasn't an accessory to anyone else's story. I slid it out and glanced at the screen. Maya, CNBC segment goes live in 5. Ready to speak. A pause. My thumb hovered over the keyboard for the briefest second. Then I typed back, "Let's begin." The hallway outside was cooler, quieter. The walls seemed to hum with leftover tension, but the air was different, sharper, freer. My mind leapt forward, already picturing the studio lights, the countdown in my earpiece, the anchor rehearsing the scripted introduction. This moment would be mine. Not curated, not filtered. Not stolen, not approved. Mine. For the first time in years, I wasn't dragging the weight of their expectations behind me. For the first time, I was standing under my own name, unborrowed, unclaimed. The studio lights still glowed in my memory when I walked back inside. I hadn't gone far, just stepped out long enough to steady my breath to feel the chill of the night cut through emotions I hadn't allowed to surface. When I returned, Delaney was waiting. She emerged from the side hallway, shoulders squared, as if her posture could still hold together the authority she was losing. But her eyes betrayed her glassy unsteady. Not with tears. No, she wasn't crying. It was something more fragile. It was the recognition that her version of the story, her carefully constructed narrative, had finally unraveled. "I was just trying to protect you," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard in years. The bravado was gone, stripped away. Maybe I went too far. But I'm still your sister. She reached toward me, not with malice, not even with guilt. It was something closer to desperation, the kind that comes when power slips through your fingers and all you have left is the family you never truly bothered to understand. I took a step back. Not harsh, not with anger, but enough. Enough to make clear the line she had crossed was not something a hug could erase. "You weren't protecting me," I said. "Calm cutting. You were preserving your position." Behind us, the murmur of voices rose. Marcus fumbling to explain something to Gerald about managing optics, about controlling fallout. Their words tangled into meaningless background noise. I turned, facing all of them now. "No more quiet aids," I said. "No more strategic whispers in the shadows. This family has never once asked me what I was building. You've only asked what I could be shaped into. Something comfortable. Something useful. Something you could hold up without ever understanding." No one interrupted. Not a sound. I reached into my bag, pulled out my tablet, and with a single swipe, cast the CNBC segment replay to the television mounted on the wall. The screen flickered, then steadied. The opening title filled the room. Tonight's guest, Jacintha Easton, founder of Medicine Labs, Forbes billionaire. A sharp intake of breath cut through the silence. Irene. Her gasp was soft but unmistakable. No one moved. No one dared. My phone buzzed again in my hand. I lifted it, turned the screen so they all could see the preview. Subject confirmation. And in that instant, the balance shifted completely. The story was no longer theirs to tell. It was mine. Forbes billionaire feature locked and syndicated. The words glowed across my phone screen, sharp and undeniable. They all read it in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't ask questions, doesn't offer excuses, just sits heavy in the chest like a truth too sharp to swallow. It was Gerald who finally broke. His voice wasn't strong or commanding like he wanted it to be. It was low, brittle, almost translucent. I didn't know. I looked him directly in the eyes. Calm. Unshaken. You didn't ask. I didn't need to raise my voice. There was no use in shouting no satisfaction and anger. The evidence had already spoken louder than I ever could. What needed to be said was carved now in headlines broadcast across television, solidified in valuations embedded in data, and ringing louder in their silence than in any argument. Delaney kept staring at the screen like she thought it might glitch, as though if she waited long enough the story would reset into one, where she still held the narrative. Irene seemed to shrink in on herself, shoulders hunched wineglass dangling in her hand like it had become too heavy to hold. And Marcus, for once, didn't smirk, didn't roll his eyes, didn't have a clever line ready to throw. His face was blank, drained of the arrogance that usually clung to him like a second skin. I set the tablet down carefully on the entryway table as if leaving behind a piece of evidence no one could argue with. Then I picked up my coat. Not out of anger. Not out of a need to slam doors or make a dramatic exit, but because the moment had reached its natural ending. It was time. Delaney followed me, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, echoing behind me like a plea that hadn't yet found words. At the door, she stopped just close enough for me to feel her breath on the back of my neck. "So that's it?" she asked. Her voice cracked in a way that startled me. "You're just leaving." I turned slightly enough for our eyes to meet. "No," I said, steady as stone. "That's enough." Her mouth parted, but nothing came. For the first time, she had no strategy, no script, just silence. My hand was already on the door handle when I heard another voice. "Irene, will we ever be close again?" she asked. There was no manipulation in her tone this time. No performance. Just quiet, raw curiosity, almost like a child asking if something broken could ever be fixed. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. Maybe I said softly, "But not on your terms." Then I opened the door. The night air rushed against my face, cool and unfiltered, cutting through the residue of everything I had left behind inside. It was cold, but it felt honest. For the first time all night, the world around me didn't feel like a performance. The porch light above buzzed faintly as I descended the steps, its glow pale and unsteady, like even the house itself knew its hold on me was fading. At the far edge of the driveway sat my car. I had parked it deliberately away from the neat circle of polished luxury vehicles lined up like trophies near the front entrance. My car wasn't for show. It was for going places. I walked toward it slowly, not rushing. There was no urgency, no need to escape. The fight was over. I had nothing left to defend. Sliding into the driver's seat, I turned the key and the engine hummed awake. The dashboard lights flickered across the windshield, briefly catching my reflection in the glass. My hair was a little disheveled, makeup smudged at the edges, exhaustion written faintly across my skin. But my expression steady, clear, resolved. Sometimes closure doesn't come with a slammed door or a shouted goodbye. Sometimes it comes quietly like this, a hand gripping the wheel eyes fixed on the road ahead, and the knowledge that you are finally irrevocably driving your own story. By the time I reached San Francisco, dawn was only beginning to creep across the horizon. The city was still wrapped in a thin veil of mist, the kind that clings low and quiet heavy like the last moments before clarity arrives. I pulled into the underground garage of the Medicine Labs building, swiped my badge, stepped into the elevator. Alone. As the stainless steel doors slid shut, my reflection stared back at me, calm, collected. Older, maybe. Not worn down, but settled. Like something within me had finally locked into place. When I entered my office, the lights were already on. Maya was waiting, a fresh cup of coffee in hand. She didn't flood me with congratulations or chatter. She just handed me the cup and gave me a subtle nod, one that spoke louder than words. "Your 10 o'clock's been pushed to noon," she said gently. And that was it. No expectations, no rewriting, just space, just trust. And for the first time in my life, it was enough. And there it was, something unexpected sitting neatly on the edge of my desk. A bouquet, white lilies and blue irises. Their petals were fresh, soft, almost luminous against the pale light of the morning. There was no note, no card, no signature. Just silence delivered in the form of flowers. I didn't try to guess who sent them. Maybe I could have. Maybe in another version of me, I would have dissected the meanings, searched for hidden apologies in the arrangement, tried to decode which hand had reached out too late. But not now. Instead, I shifted the vase gently to the far corner of my table, out of my immediate line of sight. It wasn't anger that made me dismiss it. It wasn't even indifference. It was something quieter, steadier. I simply no longer felt obligated to interpret gestures that arrived after the fact, when the story had already been rewritten. Coffee in hand, I moved toward the window. The skyline stretched out in front of me, steel and glass cutting into the fog, the city already awake and restless. Below, San Francisco moved like it always did, fast, indifferent, honest. It's different being seen. I murmured more to myself than to anyone else. The words hung in the air for a beat. Then I added softer. But it's even more different not needing to be. I didn't check my inbox right away. For once, I gave myself the grace of stillness. Space to let the previous night settle into my bones without rushing to label it. But eventually, habit or maybe curiosity pulled me back. 3 messages waited. The first from Delaney. "I think we should talk sometime. I'll give you space, but I hope you'll reach out when you're ready." The second from Irene. "We're proud of you, even if we didn't say it when it mattered." And then Velma. "You know I always believed in you. Even when I didn't say it, you're still my niece." I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not because I was confused about how I felt, but because for the first time I wasn't. That clarity, undeniable, unshakable, was new. I drafted one response, deleted it, drafted another, deleted that too. Words suddenly felt unnecessary. Instead, I opened a browser tab. A few clicks later, I had donated a significant sum each in their names to the Girls in Tech Foundation in Oakland. Then I scheduled the confirmation receipts to be mailed directly to their homes. No explanation. No message. Just a contribution in their honor toward a future they never imagined I could belong to. By midday, the fog had thinned, and the sunlight spilled wide across the bay, sharpening the edges of the city. My calendar was packed calls with European investors, a demo lined up for a government pilot program. But I wasn't thinking about any of that when Maya slipped quietly into the office. "There's someone downstairs asking to see you," she said. I didn't have to ask who. "Gerald?" She confirmed with a small nod. "He didn't bring an appointment. He's just sitting in the lobby. Quiet." I glanced at my schedule. 20 minutes before my next call. More than enough. "Send him up," I said. Moments later, my father walked into my office. Not in the stiff suits he usually wore, not with the air of command that seemed stitched into his posture. Just jeans, a collared shirt, hands slightly unsure of where to rest. He looked around slowly, taking in the space. The glass walls, the quiet hum of the lab down the hall, the clean lines of the office that was mine. For the first time, he wasn't evaluating. He was just seeing. "Nice place," he said finally. "Thank you," I replied. Neither of us sat. We stood near the window, the skyline stretched out behind me. Silence filling the room in waves. Not uncomfortable, just unpracticed. "I didn't come here to talk about the past," he said at last. His voice was steady but softer than I'd ever heard it. "I just wanted to see where it all happens." I nodded once. We walked together through the corridor. No rehearsed tour, no speeches, just quiet steps. I showed him the workspace where ideas took form, the lab rooms where theories turned into something real, the lounge where my team, my chosen family shared late nights and early mornings. He didn't comment much, but he looked. Really looked. Not with judgment, not with the old hunger to fix, but with something closer to respect. And then as we paused outside the server room, he spoke again. I didn't understand it, Jace. Still don't. But it's yours. And I respect it. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't an attempt to rewrite history. But it was enough. That evening back in my apartment, I pulled out a small black frame. Inside, pressed neat and crisp, was a printed copy of the Forbes article. My name in bold. My story in full. I hung it gently on the wall near my desk, straightened it, stepped back to make sure it was level. And for the first time I smiled. Not for them, not for cameras, not even for the proof of what I'd built. I smiled because it was mine. Next to the framed Forbes article, I placed another photo, not of my family, not of polished galas or stage smiles, but of me, 10 years old, hair, unevenly cut cheeks, flushed, grinning nervously beside a cardboard trifold I'd covered with crooked marker letters. On the table in front of me was a weather predictor I had cobbled together from Lego bricks, duct tape, and scraps I'd begged from the garage. It was clumsy, fragile, held together more by imagination than engineering. And yet hidden in that little contraption was my very first algorithm, though at the time I hadn't known the word. I looked at the photo and felt something shift, like time folding in on itself. That little girl, awkward and determined, hadn't known what she would face. She hadn't known how much of her life would be spent fighting to be heard in rooms that measured her against a script she had never agreed to. But she kept building anyway. She kept trying. I sat down at my desk, the city lights brushing against the window, and glanced once at my inbox. It was already flooded with messages, investors, colleagues, acquaintances who suddenly remembered my name. Congratulations, admiration requests. I closed the laptop without reading a single one. Tomorrow I'd be boarding a flight to New York for a keynote. The cameras, the stage, the spotlight, it was all waiting. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight wasn't about speaking to the world. Tonight was about speaking only to myself. Some wounds don't bleed anymore, but they don't vanish either. They leave outlines, ghost scars that change how you carry your shoulders, how you hesitate before answering a question, how you measure kindness against memory. They shape the pauses, the silences, the small calculations you make without thinking. And yet I wouldn't erase any of it. Because growth is rarely beautiful while it's happening. It tears, it aches, it demands. But afterwards, it leaves behind something quiet, steady, unshakable. I reached for a notebook and pen, not for work, not for strategy, just for me. And on the first page in my own handwriting, I wrote one sentence. Forgiveness isn't always a conversation. Sometimes it's simply stopping the need to explain yourself. I didn't hate them. I didn't even need them to understand. That burden was gone. What mattered was this: I had already turned the page. And this time, the chapter was mine to write. Before the screen fades, before we move on, I want to leave you with this. I spent years trying to make myself small enough to fit into versions of me that others were comfortable with. I adjusted. I stayed quiet. I played polite. I smiled through rooms that didn't know how to make space for women who built something entirely their own. I thought maybe if I was careful, if I was manageable, I'd finally earn a seat at their table. But here's what I've learned. Success isn't about being recognized. It's about recognizing yourself, especially when no one else does. You don't owe your growth to people who only show up when the headlines change. You don't need to wait for applause to know you've done something extraordinary. The moment you stop asking for permission is the moment you begin to own your life. And maybe you've been there too, shrinking, bending, waiting for approval that never came. If you have, let this be a reminder you don't have to. Because the story isn't theirs anymore. It's yours. Silenced in a room full of family. Overlooked in your own story. Told you were too much, too loud, too different. Maybe you've tried to shrink yourself, to tuck away your edges, to stay polite just so no one else would feel uncomfortable. Maybe you've even convinced yourself that if you stayed small enough, quiet enough, agreeable enough, you'd finally belong. But here's the truth. Maybe your story was never meant to be comfortable. Maybe it was meant to be real. Real enough to break patterns. Real enough to unsettle the silence. Real enough to remind you and maybe someone else that being fully yourself is never too much. So, let me ask you, have you ever had to walk away from the version of you others tried to write just so you could finally meet the person you truly are? Have you ever felt yourself outgrowing the boxes, the labels, the expectations, and then discovered a strange, steady peace in that distance? If you have, I'd love to hear from you. If this story resonated, if even a single sentence made you pause or made you feel seen, drop a 1 in the comments, or just let me know where you're watching from. And if it didn't land with you, that's okay too. Tell me why. Tell me what felt off or share your own experience. Because this space isn't just for my voice, it's for all of ours. If this story spoke to something inside you, if it felt like holding up a mirror you didn't expect, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. Here we share moments that matter, voices that are too often unheard, and journeys that just might remind you of your own. Because at the end of the day, your voice matters too. Your story is worthy, even if no one else has said it out loud. Let's keep building a space where stories like this aren't the exception, they're the beginning.